Signs of a Cult Part 2. If you didn't see my Part 1 for signs that you or someone you know could be in a cult, I'll be sure to link it somewhere in this video and also down below in the description if you first want to go check out that video. In Part 2, what I'm going to be doing is sharing a little bit more of what I felt is my own experience from having been in a spiritual cult and having left it, having had the space to reflect on it and also research about particular cult signs or signs that I was in a cult. And the first video I would say are more commonly spoken about signs of cults from the research that I found. But in this video today, I wanted to talk on a couple of signs that I felt were a little bit more based on my personal experience rather than so much coming from the research that I saw. So the first sign I wanted to talk about in this video today was that it was very much expected or encouraged or incentivized to report on fellow members in the cult. We didn't call it the cult, we called it our community. And so what that looked like was if a fellow member was doing something that was quote unquote out of alignment with the so-called teaching of this community, if you noticed that, then you were expected and encouraged to report it to the security team or to the admin team or to the HR team, depending on what the situation was or what the offense, so-called offense was. And there was even a watch list for members that it wasn't publicly posted anywhere, but sort of inner members in the hierarchy or those employed, even though employed is not the right word because in most cases people weren't paid to take on these roles or positions. But in those positions, if somebody had a position within the cult, they would have certain access to things like this watch list. So members of the community would be placed on these so-called watch lists, and they might even lose certain benefits if they were on this watch list. They would lose the ability to maybe speak out or to endorse or to appear in more public settings, or they would lose the endorsement of the cult members and the cult leaders. And so I think what also happened as a result of this, and this was my own experience too, it fostered a great deal of a feeling of not really being safe, as though you couldn't really speak out, you couldn't really be yourself, you couldn't really be honest with anyone, you couldn't really trust anyone there. And I think for myself too, this feeling of not really having privacy, and this sort of can be a spiritual idea, sort of this idea that in the spiritual realm, there is no such thing as privacy because we're all one. But it was twisted in a way. It wasn't coming from a place of love and acceptance and being unified in love. It was coming from a place of, well, unless you fall in line with the narrative or the teaching, then you were considered bad, or you had to be punished in a way, or you had to make amends. There was retribution. And in some cases, people losing some of these privileges within the cult, even though I wouldn't call them privileges, because in many cases, those so-called privileges were actually just forms of doing work for free. Most of the time, we weren't compensated, at least I wasn't, for a lot of the work that I did there. And in many cases, I even had to pay for the work that I was doing. So that was very exploitative. I spoke a little bit about the exploitation in part 1, but this was sort of the more inner sort of specifics of this particular cult that I had been in. And I think the really sad part for me, and this is another sign that I wanted to talk about, was very often out of a sense of fear or self-preservation, I would do things that I would like to think I would not normally do, as in I would do things that I feel are out of integrity or out of character, right? Like I hope so in any case, but out of a sense of wanting to avoid punishment or wanting to just survive and kind of remain in good standing. Like this is also a term they use. Remain in good standing. I would do things that I wouldn't want to do ordinarily. This is another sign, but I use it also to talk about one of the first signs, because I too, not very often, but in a small number of cases, out of a fear of self-preservation and being exposed as going against the teaching, I would also report on fellow members, and realized with time and when I was out of the cult, like that felt really awful to me to do, because I don't think of myself as that. And I think for somebody who has not been in such a situation, or perhaps, hasn't been traumatized or abused in a cult, they might consider that as like, oh, well, this person is just not courageous, or they just don't have backbone, or they're just a rat, or why don't they stand up, or why don't they disagree, or why don't they just stick to their principles? And I think it can be very difficult when sort of judging it from an outside perspective, because now that I'm out and I've had time to recover and I'm in my process of healing, of course, as I'm reflecting on these things, I realized that that was wrong. It was wrong of me to do that. And, I've had to work with myself to forgive myself for that, and to recognize why and understand why I might have done that. But it's also a very different thing to do that when you're out of that environment, when you're no longer in the space where you're basically in a trauma response a lot of the time. That was my experience anyway. Because when you're under pressure and there's this sort of trauma behind it and there's this abusive environment and you just want to do whatever you can to be safe, then you might do things that you would not otherwise do if you were in fact in a safe environment. And you hear this spoken about also from those people who have escaped from places like North Korea, their stories as they relay the horrors of things that they've had to do. And I'm not saying my experience is, comparable to that. What I'm saying is understanding the kind of mindset or sort of consciousness that somebody is in when they're in a brainwashed place in an environment that is inherently abusive, right? Like that's what cults are. They're exploitative, they're abusive, and certain things have been turned against you within yourself. You've maybe even been programmed to do things in a way, and that does not mean I'm not accountable for those things, but it's to bring an understanding. So that's why I'm sort of relaying this information about survivors from North Korea. I've actually read some books. I've also watched some interviews from people who have survived and escaped North Korea and their experiences, and reflecting on that. But really, the thing is, so I'm not saying I'm like them. I'm saying understanding how it's different, how your whole mentality is shaped, how your mind has been manipulated, and actually being able to recover from it. Of course, you're going to reflect on those experiences very differently. So I think if you're recognizing, and I also started to recognize this within the cult, as in was realizing I don't want to do these things. Why am I doing these things? And if the answer comes down to, well, I'm doing this in order to protect myself, or to make sure that I don't get into trouble, or to sort of make amends for punishment or retribution for things that I might have done, like these are all huge red flags. These are all warning signs, essentially, that hey, you might be in a cult if you recognize you're doing things that, well, make you not like yourself, and also you feel are actually out of character for the person you feel that you are. And I think the next sign is that ultimately, I've kind of already spoken about it, but it might not be so obvious from the outset, from the beginning. It might not be your first impression of the place. It might actually look like a really wholesome and beautiful place. If you listen to the words of the so-called teaching, you might think, well, yeah, a lot of that resonates, a lot of that sounds really good. But the more that you kind of get into the inner circles, or sort of the echelons, or up the hierarchy, so to speak, the more you look beneath the surface, the more you really observe what's going on, you'll start to recognize that there is a huge amount of abuse that is taking place. And yes, it does mean you need to look beneath the surface. And very often that abuse might be hidden behind certain things, like the fact that the cult leaders perpetrate a lot of the abuse, and a lot of people try to emulate them and try to copy their behavior, and so that abuse sort of trickles down the hierarchy. In another way, you might recognize there's a lot of abuse just through the exploitation that I've already talked about, as in being expected to do things without compensation, being expected to work really long hours, being expected to give a lot of your resources or time or energy to the cult. The next sign of a cult, this one I think is pretty clear, and this probably is present in almost all cults, at least the ones that I came across in research and from my own experiences, that there's an expectation of some kind to recruit other members, non-cult members, into the cult. They might not call it recruiting. It might be through certain sales packages. It might be through sharing the word or sharing the teaching and bringing members in to the community. Now, I don't think all communities are cults. Obviously, if you have a really beautiful community and you want to grow your community, you want to share the things that you're doing, there is a difference between that and members of the cult being expected and incentivized in order to recruit, which is the case in the cult that I've been talking about here. So basically, I was incentivized to recruit people, I was incentivized to bring people in, and almost there was also a judgment for those people who were failing to do that, as in they might be shamed, they might be told they're not doing a good enough job. You might even, like I did too, in certain cases notice that some people are receiving criticism or receiving abuse or receiving mistreatment if they were, for example, offering services to people but not also recruiting them into the community. As in, if you were talking to people or working with them, maybe you were financially benefiting from that, but you weren't also selling the products and recruiting them into the cult, then you would receive judgment about that. And I think also if people said they didn't want to join the cult or join the classes or join the teaching or so on, it was seen as resistance to this teaching and it was considered unacceptable. And so in certain cases, if for example, there are tiers, right, as in levels and echelons in the hierarchy, there were echelons of products too. So if you had bought into a little bit, you were expected also to then progress and buy even more and buy even more of the products. And so if you were, say, had bought one product but you were resisting buying more, then you would also often receive a lot of mistreatment or be told that you had blocks to heal and you had things that you had to work on and you were resisting love, and these are the kinds of things. So that for me is a massive warning sign, because spirituality and love, they don't force. You always have the choice to decide if something feels right to you. And of course, even if you happen to have a so-called block, being shown that is not going to come from a place of being pushy and being told you have to, or being manipulated into having to buy into something that does not feel right to you. The next sign is there was an expectation on some level to worship the leader, even though they didn't necessarily say that. They would give themselves titles, they would expect gifts, they would expect treatment of a certain kind, so to speak. They would expect reverence, they would expect you to be obedient and listen to them. So that's the way that I understood worshipping. But more than that is that if you were expressing views that might be interpreted by another cult member, especially if that person had a sort of hierarchical role, if you were expressing views that they considered contradictory to what the leaders had said or decreed or so on, you were considered like you were going in defiance, or you were rejecting them, and that was seen as a negative thing, as a bad thing. And so you might experience mistreatment or abuse or be put on the so-called watch list and all these kinds of things. So any place where there's a leader and they're actually just people, but they've been elevated through artificial means, and I say artificial because it's not something really tangible, even though they want to convince you that they may be experts or that they are more awakened than you or they have access to spiritual knowledge that you don't have. These for me are huge warning signs. And the next one is that it's especially for the leaders and those in the hierarchy, I observed it, and also it was often encouraged, that there was a lot of lying and deceit. And what I say, and the reason I say that is because often the truth was twisted in such a way that it was intended to deceive. So you might say, well, the truth is open to interpretation, but what I'm trying to point out here is that often there were blatant lies being told if it went against what their image was or what their teaching was. It was countered with lies and deceit. And I could give examples, but I don't really want to go into that. Not least of which because I don't want to attract their horde of, sometimes they send their horde of people after people if they speak out. So I don't necessarily want to attract drama of that kind. But the reason I'm making this video and maybe I should have said this at the start, is because I do think that talking about these things is important. I think highlighting these things, highlighting experiences, and empowering people to know the truth is really important. And the reason is because when we know the truth, we can make informed decisions. Now, maybe you want to share this with somebody you think could be in a cult, or maybe you're the person who's thinking, maybe I'm in the cult. I don't know. I think really what it came down to for me is I had to realize it for myself and make my own decision to leave. Nobody came and rescued me. I didn't have sort of, even though people tried, I talked about this in the first part 1, 2, the first video. Some of my close friends who were concerned, they did try, they suspected it was a cult. And I chose to stay for a while after that. So I think that the reason is that knowledge is, like, sharing the truth is important because knowledge is empowering. So that's why I'm not choosing to go into huge amounts of detail. But I also think that actually allowing yourself to come to an understanding about this and speaking openly about these things will also dispel a lot of the fear that is around this cult mentality. Because a lot of the reason I think personally I also stayed so long was because I was afraid that if I left, something bad was going to happen to me. And that too is condemned. Leaving the cult, another big sign, is condemned, and it makes you out to be a terrible person, or that, you know, you've chosen something really awful, and in a way condemns you almost to a version of quote unquote hell, right? And so I think really understanding that nothing bad is going to happen to you, and that if you are really trusting yourself and trusting love and trusting God in your life, God would not want you to suffer through something that's really wrong and really bad, and calling out these things because it is problematic. It is really awful. And I'm not saying this to shame individuals or shame the people running the show. That's the place, right? That's not my goal here. My goal is just to say that it's okay to recognize when something doesn't serve you, and to dispel the fear around it and the illusion and this whole image that's being created around it, and to decide for yourself, I'm ready really to make a decision for myself, to trust myself and to trust that I am protected and safe by God and by love to do what is right for me, and to love myself enough to say no. And I think this is one of my final points here, closing out this video, is it's okay to say no. And a massive, massive red flag in this cult was that so many of my personal boundaries were disrespected. At one point, a person even told me, a person with rank, so-called rank, even though all the ranks and hierarchies are all fictional, all made up, they're not backed by anything real. I was told I was not allowed to have any boundaries in our professional working relationship, and that is a lie. You can say no. At other points, I was punished for saying no, by being on this watch list and so on. And whenever somebody disrespects your boundaries, they're communicating to you that they really don't respect you. As long as you've communicated it's a boundary, and you know, it's not sort of a hidden boundary that's a boundary for you, but you haven't said it. Like, so when somebody is disrespecting your boundary that you've communicated, they are communicating to you, I don't respect you. And if you're in a place like in a cult, they don't care about you. They really do not respect you. They might say they do. They might pretend for a while they do. And maybe in some cases, some members are sincere. Maybe they just haven't realized where they are yet. But ultimately, if you're not being respected, I don't think that is the place for you. Where you are meant to be, where your tribe is, so where your community is, your true community. You will be loved and supported and respected, and you will be able to have and maintain boundaries. So these are the signs I wanted to cover in this video, and this concludes today's video. If this brought up some questions for you, if you wanted to share your own experiences, you are of course welcome to share it in the comment section of this video. Thank you so much for joining me in this video here today. I do hope to see you in the next one. Take care on your journey. Bye.